The airport was alive with its usual chorus, the squeak of rolling suitcases, the shuffle of shoes across polished floors, and the echo of last-minute announcements blaring through the loudspeakers. It was a scene repeated in hundreds of airports across the country, but in this one corner of America, something was about to unfold that no one could have imagined. She moved through the crowd like a shadow slipping unnoticed between pools of light. There was nothing remarkable about her. She wasn't dressed in a way that drew attention. Her jeans were plain, her jacket unbranded, her hair tied back in a simple knot. She carried only a single piece of luggage, a black roller bag that had seen better days, and a smaller tote slung casually across her shoulder. If you were asked to pick her out of a lineup of travelers, you'd likely forget her face the moment you looked away. And that was the point. Around her, families wrestled with strollers and diaper bags. A group of college students in sweatshirts laughed too loudly as they hurried toward their gate, juggling energy drinks and boarding passes. A businessman in a pressed suit paced in circles while barking into his phone, his voice tight with stress. Everyone was wrapped in their own little dramas, vacations, reunions, deadlines, frustrations. Nobody paid attention to the woman weaving silently through it all, because why would they? She was, by all appearances, just another passenger. At the security checkpoint, she smiled politely at the TSA agent, slipped off her sneakers and slid her tote into the plastic bin. Her laptop went into another. She moved with quiet efficiency, neither too rushed nor too slow, as though she'd done this 100 times before. And she had. Airports were no stranger to her. Flying had become part of her life, but never under circumstances like these. The agent waved her through, and the machine beeped its usual sterile chime as she walked past. She gathered her belongings with steady hands, though her heart was hammering harder than she let show. Every part of her routine, the way she adjusted her jacket, the way she zipped her tote, was rehearsed to appear ordinary. Blending in wasn't just a preference, it was her survival. When she reached the gate, the scene was as unremarkable as any other. Rows of chairs filled with weary travelers, some dozing, some scrolling endlessly through their phones, others staring out at the tarmac where ground crews bustled beneath the rising sun. She found an empty seat in the corner and lowered herself into it, pulling out a paperback book. The title wasn't important. She didn't intend to read it. It was simply another layer of camouflage, a signal that she was as ordinary as everyone else. But inside, her thoughts churned. She glanced around the gate area without moving her head too much. A habit, an instinct. She noted the young couple sharing earbuds, the older man rubbing his temples, the mother whispering to her child. She mapped every face in her mind, them, measuring them. Were they all truly just passengers like her, or could one of them be watching? Could one of them be waiting for her? She didn't know, and that uncertainty was the hardest part. When the boarding announcement came over the intercom, she rose with the rest of the crowd, sliding seamlessly into the shuffle of people scanning tickets and filing down the jet bridge. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel mixed with the metallic tang of recycled air. She kept her steps even, her face calm, even as the truth pressed down on her chest. She wasn't just another passenger. But nobody here could know that. Inside the cabin, the scene was mundane, a flight attendant greeting each traveler with a tired smile, passengers fumbling with overhead bins, the low rumble of conversation as people claimed their seats. She found hers in the middle of row 14, an aisle seat, perfect for slipping in and out without attracting notice. She stowed her tote beneath the seat in front of her and buckled in. Around her, life unfolded with all its ordinary rhythms. A toddler fussed, a man cracked open a newspaper, two teenagers whispered and laughed over a phone screen. The engines roared to life, vibrating through the floor. To everyone else, this was just another flight to another city. To her, it was a flight that could change everything. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, she allowed herself one long breath, steady and quiet. From the outside, she was nothing more than a face in the crowd. But she knew the truth. She was the reason this flight mattered more than anyone else could guess. And soon the skis would prove it. The plane climbed steadily, engines humming like a deep, constant heartbeat. The city below shrank into a patchwork of streets and rivers until clouds swallowed the view altogether. Inside the cabin, life unfolded in familiar patterns. Seat belts clicked open, overhead lights dimmed, and passengers settled into the ritual of long-distance travel. The woman in row 14 sat quietly, her hands resting neatly in her lap. To the casual observer, she looked no different from anyone else, just another weary traveler beginning another routine flight. She tilted her head slightly toward the window, watching sunlight scatter across the tops of the clouds. It was a view she had seen countless times, but today it felt sharper, as though her mind refused to let her forget even the smallest detail. Around her, the little dramas of the cabin played out. A businessman 2 rows ahead was already buried in spreadsheets on his laptop, fingers flying over the keys. A teenager behind her slipped earbuds in and tapped his foot to music no one else could hear. The toddler across the aisle was fascinated by the buckle, clicking it open and shut until his exhausted mother finally distracted him with a coloring book. There was comfort in this ordinariness. Every sound, every motion wrapped the passengers in the illusion of safety. Flights were predictable: takeoff, meal service, landing. Nobody ever expected the extraordinary at 30,000 feet, and that was exactly why she had been placed here among them, to hide in plain sight. A flight attendant appeared, pushing a cart stocked with drinks and pretzels. Her voice carried that practiced cheer: "Coffee, tea, juice." The woman in row 14 offered a small smile and asked for water. She accepted the plastic cup with a polite nod, then returned to staring out the window. It was a role she had perfected: polite, forgettable, invisible. But invisibility came with a price. It meant hours of stillness, of forcing herself to remain calm when her body ached to turn around, to check again and again who was watching her. She resisted the urge. Paranoia made mistakes. Mistakes got people noticed. She thought about the people who had put her on this flight. Agents in plain suits, their words firm but not unkind: "You'll be safe." Commercial flights are harder to trace. "Stay quiet, stay ordinary, and no one will ever know who you are." She had nodded, pretending the words comforted her, but in truth, she knew safety was always fragile. Her gaze drifted across the cabin once more. The man in the suit typing furiously. The woman adjusting her neck pillow. The teenager dozing off. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. And yet she couldn't shake the sense that every detail mattered, that her life now depended on remaining one step ahead of danger she couldn't yet see. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and practiced. "Ladies, we've reached our cruising altitude. Weather looks smooth ahead and we'll be landing on time." The cabin filled with the rustle of unfastening, overhead bins clicking open, and passengers stretching their legs. Laughter bubbled from somewhere in the back. For a moment, it almost felt like she could exhale. Almost. She lifted her plastic cup and sipped, the water cool on her tongue. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, half hidden by the glare of the sun. To anyone else, she was anonymous, unremarkable. But she knew that somewhere beyond the clouds, eyes were watching more closely than anyone in this cabin realized. And then came the thought she always tried to push away: what if they find me here? What if ordinary isn't enough this time? She folded her hands again and forced her breathing to steady. Around her, the cabin remained blissfully unaware. Passengers scrolled through phones, ordered snacks and adjusted blankets, oblivious to the quiet storm beneath her calm surface. It was routine in the skis, just like always. But she knew routine never lasted forever. And soon the cracks would appear, deep beneath fluorescent lights, inside a secure military facility tucked away on American soil. The radar room pulsed with its usual rhythm. Screens glowed green and white, lines of data scrolled endlessly, and operators sat hunched over consoles, eyes sharp and alert. Most days were uneventful, commercial flights crisscrossing the sky, their movements predictable and routine. But today, one flight drew a second glance. A junior operator noticed it first. A blip moved steadily across the screen, nothing remarkable at first glance. Flight 228 commercial on schedule. But then a red-coded alert flickered in the system's database. He leaned closer, squinting at the line of text. The flight wasn't marked as a threat yet, but it was flagged under a different category, one that rarely appeared: priority monitoring. Sir," he called, his voice steady but curious. "This one's got a tag." His supervisor rolled his chair over, peering at the monitor. The man's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what that code meant. Not a terrorist, not a missing transponder, something else, something classified. Within minutes, phones were ringing, messages flashing across secured channels. A chain of commands spun into motion, each link moving faster than the last. Somewhere above them, a decision had already been made: scramble and escort. At a nearby airbase, two fighter pilots suited up without hesitation. To them, it didn't matter who or what was. Orders were orders. Within minutes, the roar of engines split the quiet morning and two F-16s thundered into the skies, cutting across the clouds with lethal grace. Their mission was simple: find Flight 228, lock formation, and protect it at any cost. Back in the radar room, operators tracked every move, their voices clipped and precise. Coordinates, altitude, speed. The commercial jet carried on, oblivious, its passengers sipping sodas and watching movies while military eyes monitored their every mile. One operator glanced at his colleague, lowering his voice. "You think it's a VIP?" The other shook his head. "If it was, it'd be marked differently. This is something else." The truth, of course, wasn't written anywhere on the radar screen. The truth sat quietly in row 14, aisle seat, staring out the window with a calmness she didn't entirely feel. She had no idea that, hundreds of miles away, men and women in uniform were already moving because of her. No idea that fighter jets were slicing through the sky toward her plane. And yet, deep down, she wasn't surprised. She had expected that something like this might happen. Her presence on that flight wasn't just another booking. It was a calculated decision made in conference rooms she would never see. Above the clouds, the two F-16s approached, their pilots scanning the horizon until the white fuselage of the commercial airliner appeared. From a distance, it looked fragile, almost vulnerable against the vast sky. But the pilots knew better. That plane carried something, or someone, so valuable that their presence was non-negotiable. "Target acquired," one pilot reported calmly. "Maintain formation," came the command from ground control. And so they did, tucking in close enough to be seen by anyone peering out a passenger window. Inside the cabin, life still ticked on in its ordinary rhythm. Drinks were poured, laughter rose in bursts, and a few passengers had already drifted into naps. The woman in row 14 kept her gaze on the clouds, but the faintest tightening of her jaw betrayed her thoughts. If the jets had arrived, then the mission was shifting. Her cover was safe for now, but cover never lasted forever. In the radar room, the operators continued their work with quiet urgency. They monitored airspace for threats, every movement around Flight 228 scrutinized. Nothing would be allowed to approach unnoticed. For them, this was duty. For the passengers, it was a story yet to begin. The skis looked calm, but a storm of secrets was gathering. And soon, every soul aboard Flight 228 would realize their journey was not routine after all. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of a boy's eye. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, pointing excitedly. "Look, Mom, look at that plane." His voice carried, sharp with the kind of wonder only a child could summon. Heads turned, faces pressed against windows, and then the whispers began. There, gliding with sharp precision just beyond the wingtip, was a gray fighter jet. Its sleek frame glinted in the morning sun, every movement exact, deliberate. Passengers gasped. Some reached for phones, fumbling to capture a picture. A few laughed nervously as if it were some odd coincidence, an air show in the middle of nowhere. But their laughter didn't last. Because then came the second one. Another fighter slipped into view on the opposite side, matching the airliner's speed perfectly, its nose tilted slightly downward as though scanning the length of the passenger plane. The formation was too close, too intentional to be anything casual. Even those unfamiliar with military aircraft could tell this wasn't random. The mood shifted instantly. The boy's excitement gave way to his mother's unease as she pulled him back from the window. A man in a suit muttered under his breath, "This can't be normal." Across the aisle, a woman clasped her hands tightly in her lap, eyes wide with worry. The whispers grew louder, rippling from row to row. "Why are they here? Is something wrong with the plane? Are we in danger?" The flight attendants moved briskly down the aisles, plastering smiles on their faces, but their eyes betrayed them. They spoke in hushed tones to each other, glancing toward the cockpit more often than usual. Their reassurances, "Everything's fine, sir. Nothing to worry about," rang hollow against the sight of two armed fighters shadowing them through the sky. Row 14 was no exception. The woman sitting there felt the atmosphere shift like a wave rolling through the cabin. She didn't look out the window. She didn't need to. The change in energy, the nervous shuffle of bodies, the sudden silence followed by bursts of whispered speculation, it told her everything she needed to know. They had arrived. Her breathing remained steady, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her heart thudded in her chest. The escort wasn't unexpected. What unsettled her was the attention it was drawing. The entire cabin was now fixated on the mystery outside. For someone who depended on invisibility, attention was dangerous. Behind her, a teenager whispered, "Dude, I think there's like terrorists on board." His friend hissed back, "Don't say that." But the thought had already rooted itself in the minds of others. Paranoia is contagious, and soon the cabin was buzzing with theories. Hijacking, bomb threat, engine failure. Each guess was worse than the last, and none came close to the truth. The captain's voice broke through at last, calm but clipped. "Ladies, and this is your captain speaking. You may have noticed the military aircraft flying alongside us. They are here as a precautionary measure to ensure a safe flight. There is no cause for concern." But his tone, slightly too rehearsed, slightly too careful, only deepened the unease. Passengers exchanged looks. No cause for concern. Fighter jets with visible weapons weren't precautionary to anyone. In row 14, the woman lowered her gaze, careful not to meet anyone's eyes. The escort meant protection, yes, but also exposure. Every second those jets flew beside them, more suspicion brewed inside this cabin. Someone, sooner or later, might begin to look at her differently. A flight attendant paused near her row, offering a strained smile. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" She shook her head politely. "No, thank you." The attendant moved on, but the woman caught the glance she cast toward the window, nervous, almost fearful. The staff knew more than they could admit. Passengers continued to murmur, phones pressed against windows in shaky hands. Some snapped photos, others filmed short videos, eager to capture proof of this surreal moment. Most, though, sat rigid, hearts pounding, wondering if they should be bracing for something worse. And still the fighters held their place, silent, watchful, unyielding guardians. For the passengers, it was a bizarre, unsettling spectacle. For her, it was confirmation that the walls around her secret life were closing in. The illusion of being just another passenger was shattering. And once it was gone, there would be no turning back. She sat quietly in row 14, her posture calm, her eyes fixed on the in front of her. To anyone watching, she appeared serene, detached from the nervous chatter swirling through the cabin. But inside, her thoughts ran like wildfire. The escort meant she had been located, identified, and prioritized. The protective veil of anonymity she had relied on was thinning with every passing mile. What no one around her knew, what no one could guess, was that she wasn't just a traveler on her way to another city. She was a piece of a puzzle far larger than this flight. Months earlier, she had walked into a federal office and spoken words that changed everything. Words that peeled back layers of corruption, exposing powerful men and dangerous networks. Her testimony had set off investigations that rattled through the highest tiers of organized crime. She hadn't wanted to be there, hadn't wanted to get involved at all, but fate, or perhaps conscience, had forced her hand. And once the words left her mouth, there was no going back. Her name was now hidden in documents few would ever see. To the world, she didn't exist anymore, not in any official sense. The Witness Protection Program had given her a new identity, a new life. But erasing the past was never so simple. Enemies had long arms and whispers traveled faster than truth. So here she was, seated among families, businessmen, and vacationers, pretending she was one of them, pretending she was nobody. But in reality, she carried information that could destroy men who would rather see her silenced forever. The mother beside her shifted uneasily, pulling her child close. "Do you think we're in danger?" she whispered, eyes darting toward the window where the fighter jet kept its silent vigil. The woman in row 14 forced a small, polite smile. "I'm sure everything's fine," she said softly. Her voice was steady, convincing. Years of practice had taught her how to sound ordinary, how to blend in. The mother seemed comforted, if only slightly, and returned her attention to her child. But inside, the woman's pulse drummed harder. Fine. No, nothing about this was fine. She thought back to the last briefing, the agent's words echoing in her mind. "You'll be moved quietly. A commercial flight is less suspicious than private transport. Nobody will notice you." They had been wrong. The world was noticing now. Passengers stared, whispered, speculated. Attention was the one thing she couldn't afford. Her eyes flicked toward the aisle, watching the flight attendants exchange another tense glance. They knew something, though not everything. The captain knew more, but even he likely hadn't been told the whole truth. Only a handful of people understood who she really was, and why 2 fighter jets had been ordered to shadow this plane. And that was exactly how it had to be. The less people knew, the safer they were. If the cabin full of restless passengers realized they were sharing air with a federal witness whose testimony could topple empires, panic would spread like fire. Someone might even try to guess which one of them she was, and that guessing game could end in disaster. So she sat there, still and quiet, a mask of calm on her face. She turned her gaze back to the clouds, as though the outside world fascinated her more than the chaos brewing inside. But her mind never stopped working. She replayed the instructions she had been given, the protocols drilled into her. If anything happened, if someone tried to breach the plane, if someone recognized her, there were measures in place. The escort was part of it, but not all. Others were watching too, somewhere beyond sight. She wasn't alone. And yet, sitting in row 14 with ordinary passengers brushing elbows beside her, she had never felt more isolated. The whispering in the cabin grew louder. Someone muttered about military drills. Another insisted it must be a threat to national security. A teenager speculated about UFOs, drawing nervous laughter. No one came close to the truth. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. She couldn't let fear show. Not here, not now. She had chosen this path, or maybe it had chosen her. Either way, there was no turning back. She wasn't just another passenger. She was the reason those fighter jets were there. And every mile they flew brought her closer to both safety and danger. The cabin had changed. The cheerful chatter of takeoff was gone, replaced by the low hum of speculation. Words carried in hushed tones, fragments of fear and theory bouncing from row to row. The presence of the fighter jets outside had infected everyone with unease, a shared pulse of dread beating beneath the drone of the engines. It started in whispers. "Do you think we're being hijacked?" one man asked, leaning toward his wife. She shook her head quickly, though her eyes betrayed doubt. Behind them, another passenger murmured, No, I heard once the military only shows up if there's a bomb threat." A young woman clutched her armrest at the word bomb. Paranoia spread like smoke through the cabin. Each rumor was worse than the last, and none could be dismissed outright. Humans feared what they didn't understand, and few things were harder to explain than two war machines escorting a plane full of civilians. The woman in row 14 sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her face neutral. She had trained herself for this, how to blend in when the air thickened with fear. But she could feel it pressing against her skin, a tide of suspicion rising with every sideways glance. People were looking at each other differently now, measuring faces, searching for the cause of the escort. And in that environment, invisibility became fragile. A teenage boy behind her whispered too loudly, "I bet someone on here is dangerous, like really dangerous." His friend elbowed him sharply, but the idea had already taken root in the minds of nearby passengers. Eyes darted across the rows, subtle but telling. Who? Who among them could warrant fighter jets? The tension deepened when a flight attendant passed through with forced brightness. "Everyone's safe, I promise," she said, her voice a little too rehearsed. "We'll be arriving on time, and there's nothing to worry about." She smiled, but her eyes flicked nervously toward the cockpit as she moved on. The passengers weren't convinced. "If there's nothing to worry about, why are those things still out there?" A man muttered, his knuckles white around the armrest. Phones lit up as people tried to capture photos and shaky videos of the jets. A few whispered about texting loved ones, though the spotty signal at 30,000 feet left messages unsent. The inability to communicate only fueled their panic. They were trapped in a sealed capsule with questions and no answers. The woman in row 14 kept her expression steady, but her thoughts were racing. Each whisper, each speculative glance tightened the noose around her. She knew how fragile her cover was. It wouldn't take much, just one curious passenger, one wrong word, for suspicion to turn into dangerous attention. A man across the aisle leaned over suddenly, lowering his voice. "Strange, huh? I've flown for 30 years, never seen this before. Makes you wonder what's really going on." His eyes lingered on her, probing for a response. She offered a polite shrug, her voice calm and unremarkable. "I'm sure it's just a precaution." He studied her for a second longer than she liked, then leaned back, muttering something under his breath. Her heart gave one sharp thud before she forced herself to breathe evenly again. The captain's voice returned, calm but clipped, filling the cabin. "Ladies and we are in constant communication with military control. This escort is purely precautionary. We will continue our flight path as planned, and you are in no danger." But his assurance landed hollow. Passengers exchanged skeptical looks. Some nodded stiffly, clinging to the words like a lifeline. Others shook their heads, certain the truth was being hidden. One woman clutched her rosary beads tightly, lips moving in silent prayer. A businessman scrolled furiously through his phone as though information might magically appear. A child asked too loudly, "Mom, are we gonna crash?" The mother hushed him quickly, though her own eyes brimmed with fear. The cabin was a powder keg. And in the middle of it all, the woman who caused it sat perfectly still, trying not to breathe too loudly. She told herself to stay calm, to ride the storm of speculation, but she knew it couldn't last forever. Every mile they flew, the tension grew sharper, heavier. People wanted answers, and eventually someone would demand them. The question wasn't if they would find out who she really was. The question was when. The minutes dragged like hours. Outside, the two fighter jets held their silent vigil, never wavering, never drifting even an inch from their formation. They were shadows with teeth, close enough for passengers to see the sun glint off their wings, close enough to remind everyone that the ordinary rhythm of flight had been shattered. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted again, not panic now, but a tense, brittle silence. Conversations had dwindled into murmurs, and even the children, once restless, seemed subdued by the weight pressing on the air. Every glance toward the windows carried the same unspoken question: why are they still here? The woman in row 14 sat unmoving, her gaze fixed on the clouds. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to keep her hands still. Each second that passed felt like a test of endurance. The escort meant she was safe, that no external threat could touch this plane without being noticed. But safety, she knew, was never simple. Safety for her often meant danger for everyone else around her. She felt the irony pressing in on her. The passengers believed the fighters were guarding them. In truth, they were guarding her. A man, too, rose up, leaned toward his, whispering, "I think they'd have pulled us down by now if we were in danger. Maybe it's just escorting some government official." His companion frowned. "Then why use a commercial flight? That doesn't make sense." The woman's jaw tightened ever so slightly. He was right. It didn't make sense, unless the official wasn't supposed to be noticed, unless the safest way to hide was to vanish in plain sight. The flight attendants made another round, offering drinks and snacks with strained cheerfulness. Few passengers accepted. A woman near the back asked quietly if she could speak to the captain. The attendant gently refused. Questions lingered unanswered, frustration mingling with fear. The captain's earlier reassurances hadn't settled the mood. They had only sharpened curiosity. In row 14, she sipped her water, letting the cold liquid anchor her. Her mind ticked steadily through possibilities. The jet's presence was expected, but their persistence was unsettling. Were they expecting an attack? Had her location leaked wider than anticipated? Or was this simply procedure, stretched into a spectacle that her fellow passengers couldn't ignore? She dared a glance sideways at the nearest window. The jet's cockpit gleamed darkly in the sun, the pilot's helmet barely visible through the glass. Whoever sat inside wasn't thinking about the passengers' questions or fears. They were locked on one mission: guard, deter, protect. Still, unease simmered in the cabin. A man across the aisle finally spoke aloud what many were thinking. "If we're really safe, then why won't they leave us alone?" His voice carried, and a ripple of murmurs followed. The woman lowered her gaze, keeping her expression neutral. She could feel suspicion growing like static in the air, little sparks leaping invisibly from row to row. People were starting to look at one another again, not casually but with evaluation. Someone must be the reason. Someone among them. But suspicion had no shape yet, no target, and that gave her time. The engines droned on, steady and powerful, carrying them closer to their destination. The captain's voice returned once more, smoother this time. "Ladies, and we are beginning our initial descent. Please fasten we appreciate your patience." A collective exhale rippled through the cabin, relief cautious but palpable. The jets were still there, but the thought of landing, of touching solid ground again, eased some of the strain. The woman kept her face still, but inside tension coiled. Descent meant exposure. Airports meant movement, surveillance, potential breach. The closer they got to landing, the closer she was to both safety and danger in equal measure. The passengers didn't know it, but the escort had done its job. No threats had approached. No danger had broken the fragile bubble of this flight. They would step off with a strange story to tell, a memory to recount at dinner tables and offices. But for her, the story wasn't something to tell. It was survival, carried quietly in her chest, heavy and unspoken. Safe passage, yes. But the journey was far from over. The plane began its descent, nose dipping gently as the skyline grew larger in the distance. For most passengers, the sight of land brought a rush of relief. Shoulders loosened, nervous chatter returned, and the eerie quiet that had gripped the cabin for hours began to fade. They were going to make it. The woman in row 14 felt the shift too, but not as comfort. For her, the landing meant the end of invisibility. At 30,000 feet, the cabin had been a sealed capsule, paranoia swirling but with nowhere for it to act. On the ground, the rules changed. The moment those doors opened, eyes, cameras, and threats could pour in from every angle. Outside, the fighter jets kept pace, their wings gleaming like blades in the late sun. They would not leave until the wheels kissed the runway. Their unwavering presence reminded her that whatever waited below, she had not been forgotten, nor abandoned. but it also reminded her that the danger was real enough to require such guardians. The captain's voice returned, calm and professional. "Ladies, we have been cleared for landing. Please fasten your and ensure all belongings are stowed." Passengers obeyed quickly, eager to reach safety. A few smiled weakly at one another, sharing the unspoken bond of having lived through something strange and unsettling together. Some even joked nervously about posting their photos of the jets online. Already, they were turning the ordeal into a story. The woman didn't smile. She sat with her belt tight, hands folded, eyes forward. The hum of the engines deepened as the flaps extended, the plane shuddering in controlled descent. She breathed slowly, counting each inhale, each exhale, centering herself for what was to come. The runway rose fast and then impact. A jolt, a roar of wheels, and the familiar rush of deceleration as the engines reversed. Gasps and sighs filled the cabin, some passengers clapping softly in gratitude. They were down. Safe. Or so they believed. The woman felt the jet escort peel away, banking sharply as the commercial plane slowed to taxi speed. Their mission, at least this part of it, was complete, but her mission was just beginning again. The passengers craned their necks toward the windows, relieved laughter bubbling up now. "We made it," a man said loudly, patting his neighbor on the shoulder. A child bounced in her seat, chanting, "We're safe! We're safe!" The mood lightened, as though fear had never filled the air just minutes earlier. The woman let their relief wash around her without touching her. Them, in a way, the ability to step off this plane and move on, to tell their families about that one weird flight with fighter jets, and then forget. For her, forgetting was a luxury long lost. As the plane taxied toward the gate, she noticed movement on the ground. Black SUVs waited near the terminal, their tinted windows glinting in the fading sun. To most passengers, they would look like airport security vehicles, nothing unusual. To her, they were the signal. Her escort on the ground was ready. The sign dinged off and passengers rose quickly, retrieving bags, stretching stiff limbs. Relief gave way to impatience, everyone eager to step into the terminal to breathe free air again. The woman remained seated as instructed. Her heart pounded steady, not from fear but from readiness. She knew the procedure. She would be the last to leave. Agents would appear, blending as travelers, guiding her out unseen. The world would think she was just another passenger lingering, perhaps waiting for a bag. Around her, people shuffled and laughed, already calling loved ones to announce their safe arrival. No one would ever know that the reason for the jets, the whispers, the fear, that reason had been sitting quietly in row 14 all along. The line of passengers thinned. Finally, an attendant gave her a brief nod. It was time. She stood, adjusted her jacket, and joined the empty aisle. Her steps were steady, practiced. At the doorway, the late evening light spilled in. Two men waited just beyond the jet bridge, casual in appearance, but their eyes sharp. She walked between them without a word, swallowed by their presence, disappearing seamlessly into the flow of the airport. Behind her, the rest of the passengers spilled into baggage claim, shaking their heads and laughing nervously. Their ordeal was already dissolving into memory. But for her, memory was all she carried. Another city, another name, another beginning. She had survived this flight, but survival was only one chapter in a story that had no true ending. And so, as the airport swallowed her into anonymity once more, she vanished like she always did, just another passenger. But the fighter jets in the sky knew better.